This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 24th, 1922, the Colorado River Commission officially allocated water rights to the 7 U.S. states of the Colorado River Basin. That is Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, all the states that are part of the rapidly expanding American Southwest and all the states that need water to do that expansion. This agreement, along with some subsequent agreements, became known as the Law of the River and helped ease years of dispute among these states. So, yes, listeners, this is an episode about water rights and a water rights treaty, but I think anyone who has lived in the region or anyone who has watched Chinatown or read Joan Didion or has followed more recent climate change developments knows that water is power, especially in this region. And the story of those 7 states who were cut into the agreement is also a story about who was cut out of those water rights, namely the Navajo tribes that lived in the region. And that is the thrust of a new podcast series hosted by Charly Edsitty, a reporter based at ABC in Houston, but who also lived and reported in Arizona for many years and is Navajo herself. So Charly, welcome to the show. Congrats on the new series, and thank you so much for doing this.
Hi, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about the latest season of Reclaimed, the Lifeblood of Navajo Nation.
And I'm going to tell people a little bit more about that series in a second. But first, let's welcome, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
So, yeah, Charly, you mentioned the series is called Reclaimed, the Lifeblood of Navajo Nation, and it's all about the history of these water disputes and the water compacts, and also about how right now, 100 years later or so, there is a new fight to rework those treaties. I should also give a shout out that some of our listeners may ring a bell, the Reclaimed series, and that's because this is the new season of a series that has previously talked about Tulsa, which we've discussed on the show, and then was also the home of that series about Emmett Till's mother, which was hosted by a good friend of the show, Leah Wright Reger. So you're kind of in company here. We know your work. We know the series. So, and this is the new season. Charly, you lived in Flagstaff for a while. Is that the sort of area where you grew up? Is that right?
Yeah. So I actually lived in Flagstaff for, I want to say, about 2 years as a bureau reporter. This was maybe about a year and a half after I had started my journey into broadcast journalism. I lived and worked up in Flagstaff, covering northern Arizona, which included a lot of tribal communities.
Yeah. And so growing up within the tribe, but also as a young reporter in Flagstaff, like how much did this treaty from 1922 feel connected to what we were seeing and living on the ground in, the 20th century, 21st century?
Growing up as a child, I grew up in a suburb of Phoenix on the west side of Phoenix called Glendale. And my parents both are Navajo. They're from the reservation. They were born there. And they really made sure that me and my sister were very connected to our extended family, our relatives, pretty much everybody who lived back home on the reservation. We call it Dinepikeya in our native language. And this is the issue with water that we grew up being very aware of. Our family was always very concerned about not wasting water, particularly on my mom's side of the family. We spent a lot of time with our grandparents over there, and we were always told, don't leave the water running. Don't go outside and play with the hose. We really weren't allowed to go outside and play with water guns because it was just perceived as being very wasteful of a resource that many people in our community did not have access to. And so it's something that I always grew up being very aware of, that there were people that lived across the Navajo Nation who didn't have access to clean running water, some people who didn't have access to electricity. And so I never really explored the detailed history of why this was happening, what occurred. I just was aware of the problem and never explored it any further than that. And so throughout the course of reporting for this podcast, it was a lot of learning new information about my own tribe and my own community, things that I had never taken the time to learn for myself.
I think that sometimes when people go out west for the first time, so I was somebody who had never spent much time at all in the Southwest, and I went this summer, and it is definitely a place where you become very quickly kind of water aware because it is so dry. And it can be a scarce resource to begin with. But I think that one of the really important things that you're doing, and maybe you can walk us through, is it's not just a natural scarcity. That's not the reason these Navajo tribes don't have access to water. I think it's often viewed or thought of or is imagined of as just, well, this is a feature of the landscape. But I was wondering if you could talk us through why it's not just a natural scarcity.
Sure, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the desert Southwest, water is literally currency. Water is gold. Water is everything. And if you don't have access to water in the desert, you're not going to get very far. And what's going on here with the situation on Navajo Nation, to your point, it's not a matter of there's not enough water to go around, which, we'll get to that in just a second. But it's more so a matter of almost finders keepers, I guess, if you want to put it that way, where unfortunately the original inhabitants of this country who found it first, they weren't included in some of the more formalized procedures that happened after the founding of the United States. We indigenous people back in 1922 at the formation of the Colorado River Compact, not very many people were speaking English at that point, let alone reading and writing and learning more about a system of government that was so foreign to them and what they knew in their own tribal communities. And when you think about current 2024 major cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, huge major cities in our country who are situated in a very, very dry part of the country, you think about the years and decades worth of infrastructure that had to be created and built in order to support the millions and millions of people who are living in these cities. And they have pools. They're watering their lawns every day. They're brushing their teeth and washing their clothes. And for many of those people, they don't even think twice about where the water is coming from and all that went into place to make sure that they could have access to it. And then you look at a place like the Navajo Nation where the infrastructure is pretty much non-existent. And you have to understand that that is part of the reason why some of these areas do not have access to running water in 2024. And instead are having to physically get in their vehicles, buy a huge 300-gallon plastic bin, put it in the back of their truck, and then drive, in some cases 30 minutes each way just to have water in their home. This is something that I saw with my own eyes happening in my community. And it's not right. It's not right.
Yeah. I mean, and it's intentional. I think that's what's really important. Like the erasure, the marginalization, the policing of that water is not just, oh, we don't know how we forgot about the Navajo. Like as though, they were an afterthought. Like when these deals are being crafted, like that community, the Navajo community is intentionally being left out of that. You think about 1922, we're talking about 100 years ago, and these battles are ongoing.
Yeah. But can you take us to 1922 and that treaty? I mean, I mentioned that there's 7 states that were kind of in dispute with one another. And so this treaty ostensibly resolved the dispute among the 7 states. But in crafting that treaty, was there even sort of consideration of the 8th party in this, the Navajo community? Or were they cut out? Were they not even invited to the table? I mean, how did this actually come together?
So you can imagine that there were these, in some cases, very newly formed states across the American Southwest. And it's just the idea of, okay, we have this state and we're trying to create a future for ourselves. How do we ensure that we can establish ourselves in the United States and basically secure our future for years and years and years to come? And a big component of that was water, because without water in the desert, again, you're not going to get very far. So the Colorado River Compact basically was created in order to create some sort of water equity among the states that were established. So they didn't want places like California or Nevada hogging all of the water and essentially leaving the other surrounding states with nothing and basically, just to figure it out and try and survive on their own. And nobody ever made any sort of, formal invitation to approach these tribes and say, would you like to have a portion of this? And we actually spoke to a scholar throughout the reporting of this podcast, and he uncovered some documents that suggest that this was done intentionally. This was done intentionally at that time because people were so, they were just adamant about having as much of that water as they possibly could in the Colorado River, and they didn't want to share it. And asking indigenous communities if they wanted a portion of it meant that they would get less water, and nobody wanted that. And it's very eye-opening and quite honestly, very heartbreaking that this was a situation that pretty much set the table for what we're seeing now, where we still have indigenous tribes who are fighting and fighting and fighting for access to this water. And meanwhile, we have millions of people across the United States who go about their day, turn on their faucets, brush their teeth, wash their hands, and don't even think about any of that.
Hey, it's Jody. I want to take a moment of your time. And I don't know if I've ever talked about where the idea for this show came from, but about 4 years ago, I left a full-time job to strike out on my own as an independent podcast producer. And the first thing on my wish list was to make a show with Radiotopia, because I knew it was the home for independent podcast creators, and some of my favorite audio makers in the world make their home here at Radiotopia. And in those 4 years, I, along with Niki and Kellie and Jacob and Brittany and you, our listeners, have been able to make exactly the show we want to make. And I'm including you on that list because you are part of this too, not just because you listen and send us comments and ideas, but because some of you have also decided to become members of Radiotopia. And that step from listener to member supporter makes all the difference in the world. So yes, it is the Radiotopia fundraiser right now, and I'm here to try and ask you to take that step from listener to member. Media is in a very rocky place right now, as I'm sure you know. The world is, too, in a pretty rocky place. And in the same way that I hope this show can help us navigate the crazy state of the world right now, support from listeners helps us try and navigate the very choppy financial waters we face as well. Making this show over the last 4 years has been a real honor. We want to keep making it, and we can only do that because of Radiotopia members. If you want to become a member, now is the time. It is the Radiotopia Fall Fundraiser. We have a goal of reaching 2,024 donors. It is 2024. And we're asking you to visit radiotopia.fm/donate. Go to radiotopia.fm/donate. You can learn lots more about how your work will help support Radiotopia, see all of the different shows that you will be backing. Once again, that's radiotopia.fm/donate. Every little bit helps. And on behalf of the whole team here, thank you for your ears and thank you for your support.
We want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Tom received a presidential pardon. He's from Harrisonburg, Virginia, and has 5 siblings. Tom gets up at 6 a.m. every morning. He's an early bird. Because he's literally a bird. A 51-pound turkey, to be specific. Tom was pardoned instead of the thousands of Americans in prison for marijuana. And this Thanksgiving, the president will pardon yet another turkey instead of those Americans. Visit peoplenotpoultry.com to tell the president to pardon people, not poultry, this Thanksgiving. A message from the Last Prisoner Project.
You said that the Navajo Nation was intentionally cut out, but as best you can characterize it, would the usage by the tribe of water actually pose a threat or impediment to the sort of expansion of the states? I mean, was it really a zero-sum game in that way?
I mean, I wouldn't imagine back in 1922 the water usage for the population on the Navajo Nation would have been immense. I mean, this wasn't a heavily populated area, but I mean, there's still human beings on these ancestral tribal lands. And so I think it just comes down to greed. Honestly, if you ask me personally, I think that a lot of things in the formation of the United States came down to greed and this idea of manifest destiny and take what is yours at whoever's expense. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of the policies and treaties that were created during this time frame really came from that mindset of conquer and destroy, manifest destiny. This is what is ordained for us. And anyone who gets in our way, they get destroyed. We obliterate them and keep moving west.
I also think this is such a great example of the way in which the U.S. used contracts and legal language and the law as weapons against indigenous people. Because there is language in the compact that says nothing in this compact shall be construed as affecting the obligations of the United States of America to Indian tribes. And there was a positive obligation that the United States had to delivering water that had been in previous treaties that had been set by the Supreme Court. And yet, basically, as soon as the compact goes into place, they're like, well, I don't think we really need to do anything with this. Or it created such elaborate hoops that you had to jump through legally in order to even begin the process of reaccessing that water, getting whatever allocation, that it makes it impossible to actually actualize that right.
I mean, the system that was set up back in 1922 really wasn't trying to cater to or help indigenous people understand exactly what was happening around them. And yeah, to your point, I think it was in a way weaponized against the Native people because they knew that if it was written in English and the conversations were happening in English and it was formalized to where it was involving the United States government, indigenous people didn't know about any of that back in 1922. I don't even think that there were very many Navajo people who were fluent in English at that point. So in 1922, I really don't think that there was anybody who was really advocating for the tribe and pushing for their water rights and to have access to the Colorado River.
I wonder, too, if you can, when we fast forward today, especially when we think about water in this area, we think about Lake Mead, we think about Lake Powell, we think about the fact that, like, climate change is having a devastating impact, when there are droughts, when the water supply is not as prevalent as it once was. That tightness on scarcity becomes even more of a negotiating, bargaining political chip that people are reckoning with. And when we think about this today, I mean, even as recently as 2023, like the Supreme Court still hasn't really solved this issue of how we look at the water supply and Navajo access to that water supply. Can you talk about where we are right now, where the struggle is right now?
So you mentioned 2023 and the Supreme Court ruling, which essentially said that the Supreme Court did not feel like it was the responsibility of the federal government to try to figure out this water situation with the Navajo Nation. It's not the federal government's responsibility, so we're not going to even...
Then who? Sorry, I'm just like...
Exactly.
I mean, that's a little like, not my problem. It's just a little...
Right. And, that's just a very small glimpse of the attitude of the federal government towards many indigenous tribes across the country, is that, they pushed us onto these tribal reservations, but they don't want to deal with the fallout of doing that. Meanwhile, indigenous people are just still sitting there saying, hey, we want to be able to turn on our faucets like everybody else across the country and have water come out of it. So the Navajo Nation spans in a portion of Arizona. It's also in New Mexico, and it's in a portion of Utah. And specifically with Arizona, because they have claim on the Colorado River, they are trying to come to some sort of agreement where both parties can move forward with the Navajo Nation taking a portion of what Arizona has on the Colorado River. And so they've made attempts before in the past, in 2010 and 2012. Both of those did not go very far because the tribe and the state of Arizona really couldn't ever come to an agreement. So what's happening right now is earlier this year, the Navajo tribe agreed and voted and approved on a settlement with the state of Arizona, which that in itself is a pretty big hurdle to get over, because usually when you're trying to ask someone for a portion of their share, they're not going to want to give it up. But both sides have come to that agreement. So at this point, now, in my opinion, it has an even bigger hurdle to get over moving through the federal government. This bill basically would give a portion of Arizona's claim to the Colorado River to the Navajo Nation. And in addition to that, it would also allot $5 billion for the building of infrastructure. across the Navajo Nation, and other tribes are included in this as well. The Hopi tribe is included, as well as the San Juan Southern Paiute tribe. They are also a part of this settlement as well. And so it's been introduced to Congress, but so far there's not a lot of movement that has happened since it was introduced. And now there are concerns about the recent election and whether that will have an impact on if this even moves any further or what's going to happen with it.
And $5 billion is the price tag?
Correct.
To create the infrastructure to get the water out there. Gotcha.
Yeah.
I know that the push has been understandably and rightfully on equity and making sure that Indigenous people have equitable access to these resources. Is there any discussion or thinking going on about equity within the broader context of the climate crisis and what happens as even what water is left, as it's equitably distributed, isn't enough for everyone who lives in the Southwest?
And that's a great question, because going back to the Colorado River Compact, as they were calculating and identifying just how much water was flowing through the Colorado River and then starting to divvy up the portions of the river to each state to be able to use, we found that they overprojected the output of the water in the river. So they've already overpromised the amount of water that's flowing in the Colorado River. So that in itself is alarming and shocking, because there's not as much water in the Colorado River as they thought in 1922. And to your point, when the discussion of climate change comes, it is a real concern. And unfortunately, I feel like the Navajo Nation is in a position to where they're having to continue to fight for their fair share. But they also were responsible users of the Colorado River hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so, they're put in this position to where they're having to fight for a natural resource that they already essentially had claim to before United States became United States. So, it's frustrating when you see, other communities across the country that maybe don't necessarily have that same belief or move about their lives doing the same. We have a saying in our community that water is life, because it really is. It's a natural resource, right, that has sustained us for hundreds of years. And the Colorado River itself is a very sacred place for us as Indigenous people. So, I think that it just speaks to how hard Navajos are wanting to fight for this and take back what was ours, what originally, we were the original users of that area along with the other tribes.
Well, look, we'll leave it there, in part because people should go listen to the full 4-part series, Reclaimed, that Charly has put together. It is full of the history and brings it to now, and you visit all of these places and really take us there. And not for nothing, I'll also say the artwork is really beautiful, which I really appreciate. So nice work on that. But the series is Reclaimed, the Lifeblood of Navajo Nation. Reporter is Charly Edsitty. And Charly, you're based in Houston now, another city that has a very complicated relationship with water. I think every place now is sort of reckoning with its relationship with water. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I really congratulate you on doing this important series.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk with all of you. And I really hope that people enjoy listening to the podcast and that they can take away more history that has happened here in our country that a lot of Americans don't know about. I think it's important to educate yourselves about Indigenous history and learn just how much of it we have here in the United States.
Oh, you're speaking our language there. We love those kinds of stories. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.